A warm welcome to you all. This is the third presentation of Anne Baring's course, The Long Journey to a New Story, The Evolution of Civilizations, Cultures and Consciousness, hosted by Ubiquity University. Just as last time, I would like to start with an invocation, which is printed in this wonderful book. And the words are from Publius Ovidius Naso, who was a Roman poet, and he lived in 30 BC. And this is what he said. There is no greater wonder than to range the starry heights, to leave the earth's dull regions, to ride the clouds, to stand on Atlas's shoulders and see far off, far down, the little figures wandering here and there, devoid of reason, anxious, in fear of death, and so advise them, and so make faith an open book. Full sail, I voyage over the boundless ocean, and I tell you, nothing is permanent in all the world. All things are fluid, every image forms, wandering through change. Time is itself a river in constant movement, and the hours flow by like water, wave on wave, pursued, pursuing, forever fugitive, forever new. That which has been is not. That which was not begins to be. Motion and moment always in process of renewal. Not even the so-called elements are constant. Nothing remains the same. The great renewer, nature, makes form from form, and oh, believe me, that nothing ever dies. Now over to you, dear, and tell us about the solar patriarchal era, the separation from nature and a battle between God and evil.
Thank you so much, Georgie. What a lovely introduction that is. So, this era is all about the emergence of the conscious mind and the ego from the matrix of instinct and the primordial soul. And it covers a period from 3500 BC until the present day. Now, I discovered yesterday through somebody else called Greg Braden that archaeologists think there were now 6 great cradles of civilization: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. In this talk, I'm going to focus on Mesopotamia, because it is in this area that the change from lunar to solar consciousness can more easily be followed. Around 3500 BC, we enter a totally different era, an era which sees the emergence of the conscious ego from the matrix of instinct and the primordial soul. This whole era is about the gradual emergence of the individual from the collective life of the tribe and the development of the conscious mind. But it is also about a violent and traumatic separation from the deeper matrix of the psyche and a withdrawal from relationship with nature, due mainly to the constant wars that were the main feature of this whole era. It is about separation and dissociation, about duality and polarization. The drive for power and dominance replaced the older lunar emphasis on relationship with a harmonious cosmic order, a relationship that had been supported by precise astronomical observation gathered over millennia. Astronomy was still very important, but it was no longer focused on aligning the human community with the cosmos. During the solar era, the sun replaced the moon as the primary celestial image. In the 3 Abrahamic or patriarchal religions, the Great Father replaced the Great Mother as the sole image of deity. Because of this, Western civilization developed on the foundation of a fundamental dissociation between spirit and nature, between creator and creation, and between the masculine and feminine archetypes associated with these. This dissociation effectively destroyed the ancient shamanic understanding of the presence of spirit in the phenomenal world and opened the way to its ultimate exploitation. Instead of there being a marriage between them, the masculine archetype assumed a position of dominance in relation to the feminine one, so that nature, soul, woman, matter, and body, the 5 aspects of the feminine archetype, were downgraded in relation to spirit, man, and mind. Now here is a diagram of the 2 phases of the evolution of consciousness as I've seen it. The lunar phase that we looked at last time, up at the top there, and the new solar phase down below. As the conscious ego emerged from the deeper matrix of the psyche, they began to grow apart. As a result, we came to look upon the cosmos, deity, and the world of nature as something separate and different from ourselves, something we could observe and explore but no longer feel part of. Mind and soul drew further and further apart. I've drawn this diagram to show more clearly how the emerging ego and the conscious mind, that yellow bit at the top, rest on top of the immensely older matrix of instinct that Jung called the primordial soul and the collective unconscious. In the older section below the thick red line are the age-old instinctual habits of the human species, and older than these, the instinctual habits of the animal and reptilian species. Memories that are held in our older brain system, the reptilian and mammalian brain, still interact with and influence our neocortical mind, the most recently developed part of our brain and nervous system. Our problems today arise from the fact that over the last 4 millennia, our ego and conscious mind, a tiny aspect of our total psyche, has become detached from the deeper matrix of the primordial soul out of which it has evolved. As time went on, the conscious mind has become more and more inflated and omnipotent, and its detachment is now complete, and it no longer has any awareness of or relationship with the psychic depths from which it has emerged, no relationship with nature or the cosmos. Like Icarus in the Greek myth, it has flown too close to the sun, and that's our situation today. The emergence of the ego and the development of the conscious mind and humanity as a whole can be recognized as the greatest evolutionary achievement of this whole solar era. But this achievement gradually opened a chasm between spirit, associated with mind, and nature, associated with the body and matter. This whole process was closely tied into the invention of writing and the power that literacy gave to a tiny elite group of educated and very powerful males. The whole population wasn't educated at all. It's just a very, very tiny proportion at the very top of the priesthood and the rulers. Gradually, the mind assumed a position of dominance over the body, and man assumed a position of dominance over nature and woman. This 5,000-year-long process was, I think, largely unconscious, and we still haven't really emerged from its influence. Now, the emphasis of this 5,500-year-long period is on the ascent to the sun, rather than on relationship with the earth and the cosmos, as in the earlier lunar era. It is about the rise of great empires, territorial conquest, and the control exercised by tribal leaders and powerful priesthoods. It is about outstanding individuals leading exploration and discovery, and the growing empowerment of humanity that these bring. It is about the quest for knowledge and understanding of the life in which all our lives are embedded. But its shadow aspect has been the sacrificial rituals of war, practiced on a monumental scale. Because the canvas of this era is so huge and so complex, I will look first at the rise of the great empires, which has continued right into our own time. Secondly, I will look at the 2 powerful mythologies or cosmologies that have dominated this era and their impact on human culture and civilization. And thirdly, I will look at the psychological aspect of the solar era as we go along and at the dangers of its unacknowledged shadow aspect. And I've sent you a couple of papers, one on rituals of sacrifice and one on the hero myth, which should be read in conjunction with what I'm saying today. So why do we lose touch with lunar consciousness? There's several factors which I'll go through. First of all, the invention of writing in Sumer, which was a tremendous step forward for civilization as a whole. Secondly, the rise of powerful priesthoods and religions. Then the incursions of Indo-European and Semitic tribes into the agricultural village communities of the Middle East. The movement from the land into fortified cities as a result. The creation of large armies. The rise of the solar hero myth with the warrior leader. And the change from great mother to great father. Now, there isn't time to go into all those in details, but you'll see as I go along that they come in. In Sumer, from about 4000 BC, we have, first of all, the cuneiform writing, invented around 3400. We have the creation of the first large city-states with a ziggurat or temple at their center. And these city-states were called Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Ur, Nippur, and another one called Kish. And from the beginning, they were constantly fighting with each other. That was just the pattern that got going. Each ziggurat had its own god or goddess and its own high priest or priestess. And Uruk had enormous walls around it and about 40 to 80,000 inhabitants. The solar era is a time of tumultuous social and political upheaval. Indo-European and Semitic tribes who worshipped sky gods invaded the peaceful river valleys, just as they had done in the civilization of old Europe. Valleys that had for millennia worshipped the Great Mother or Great Goddess. These warrior tribes had a terrifying impact on the settled communities they overran and destroyed. And wherever they went, they left a trail of devastation. They might be compared to the warriors of Islamic State today, who have regressed to the behavior pattern of that far distant time. Vast numbers of former agriculturally based people began to move to fortified walled towns that grew rapidly into large fortified cities. A largely egalitarian farming society was replaced by a new hierarchical patriarchal order ruling from the cities. Farmers were reduced to serfdom. With the rise of literacy in the priestly class, powerful bureaucracies emerged to govern these cities and later empires. Colossal temples were built like this step ziggurat at Ur. Kings appeared whose ambition was to create and rule vast empires. And these were the Akkadian, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and later the Greek, Roman, and Islamic empires, a whole sequence of empires from this very early time. Discoveries in astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and an incredible creative outpouring into temples, palaces, sculptures, and exquisite works of art of all kinds were promoted by the immense wealth of the rulers of these empires. But they were built on the sacrifice of the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men who had to face the terror of death by the sword, scimitar, or mace, as portrayed on the temple walls of Assyria and Egypt. This is the historical and social background to the change in mythology and the relationship between the masculine and feminine archetypes that was to have such a profound influence on the development of civilization. So I think you can begin to see why we had to, or why we did move from the lunar to the solar era. Now, interestingly, the solar era begins with a very great and famous Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the fifth ruler of the post-Diluvian dynasty of the city of Uruk, around 2700 BC. He was a great builder of temples and cities, and he restored Uruk after the flood, apparently. His mother was a goddess, and his father a mortal king of Uruk. This is the earliest story of a hero king and the heroic feats of an individual. if one excludes the legends of the god men who helped to restart civilization after the two cataclysms I spoke of in my first talk. This epic marks the emergence of the individual from the tribal group, and it also gives the oldest account of the flood that was passed on to Babylonia and later to the book of Genesis. His story is a fascinating one and crucially important for understanding the change from the lunar to the solar era. What happened was this. Gilgamesh had a beloved companion called Enkidu. I love the word Enkidu. And they set out to cut down the forest of cedars that belonged to the goddess. Gilgamesh is warned by the gods in a dream not to proceed with this heroic adventure because its fierce guardian, who was a giant called Humbaba, Humbaba's up there at the top, has been appointed by the gods to guard the great cedar forests of the Lebanon. But Gilgamesh defies the gods, and with the help of Enkidu, he kills Humbaba and cuts down the forest. Later, Gilgamesh also slays the bull of heaven, which may be a concealed astronomical reference to the change from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries. The goddess is outraged and curses Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And shortly after this, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh bewails his loss. And he says, "What is this sleep which holds you now? You are lost in the dark and cannot hear me." Gilgamesh sets out on a long journey in search of the herb of immortality. And on his way to the sacred mountain where it's to be found, he hears the story of the great flood from one of the two survivors of it, and learns that the goddess has caused the flood and then deeply regretted what she has done. He is given the herb of immortality, but on his way back to his city, he loses it to a serpent who snatches it as he rests by a pool. He cries out in despair, "Is it for this that I have wrung out my heart's blood? I found a sign, and now I have lost it." The Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest story of a heroic quest and the battle with a monster or a giant, and is possibly the original template for later solar myths. It's really quite lovely to read. It's not long, and you get a feeling of what Gilgamesh was like and their friendship with him and Enkidu, and the fact that they made a huge mistake, which marks the change from the lunar to the solar consciousness. Cutting down the forest was absolutely sacrilegious act, even for that time. Now, this is the earliest picture of the goddess Inanna, who held a place of paramount importance in Sumerian culture, and later as Ishtar in the Babylonian culture. This is an image of Inanna from about 2000 BC, still associated, as you can see, with the lion she's standing on, with the bird, the owl that sits on either side of her, and the serpent which is adorning her headdress, each one representing her three domains of sky, earth, and underworld. Notice her bird talons and her wings. She was worshipped as the moon goddess and also as Venus and the star Sirius. And someday, if you can manage it, read The Descent of Inanna, because it's the most extraordinary, very beautiful story of the dismantling of the robes of the moon goddess as she loses her beautiful ornaments and descends into the underworld for 3 days, and then is rescued and ascends again and puts on all her beautiful robes and her jewels and her crown again. It's a really lovely story. I should say a word about the position of women in Sumer. To begin with, they could be priestesses, transact business, and own and inherit property. But in the Akkadian north of Sumer, which later became Babylonia, and which was invaded by Semitic tribes, woman's position deteriorated until she was no more than a chattel, subject under pain of death to the control of her father and husband. Women had to be fully veiled and couldn't leave the house unless accompanied by a male relative, a custom that has lasted until our own day in some Muslim countries. Fascinating, it's gone on for so long. And this picture shows Inanna in quite a different way as goddess of war. And it shows the change in the role of the goddess as she's co-opted to support war and slaughter. The Babylonian goddess Ishtar says, "I will flay your enemies and present them to you." And there are the poor enemies crushed underfoot or with a chain in their nose or ear, I think. So that was the fate of men in those days. It was a terrible fate if you got on the wrong side of things. Now what's happening is that the psyche is in conflict because spirit and nature, head and heart, conscious mind and instinctual soul were becoming dissociated from each other. This inner conflict was projected into the world. We have a rise of a succession of great empires from the time of Sargon of Akkad around 2300 BC until the present time. War becomes endemic, promoted by warrior leaders intent on power and territorial conquest. I just lost my place for a second. The acclaimed heroic leader is the warrior who is able to defeat his enemies in war. Whereas the focus of lunar culture was on the alignment of the human community with the rhythm of the Earth's cycles and the vast living body of the cosmos, the focus of solar culture was on a desire to conquer, whether territory or tribal enemies. And we also hear this new attitude to death, completely different from the lunar era. As the Bronze Age progresses, a new thread enters the great tapestry of human evolution. It is terror, not the terror of nature, but terror of death by the hand of other human beings, and also fear of death itself, which is now final, terrifying, and absolute, without the promise of rebirth as in the lunar era. The underworld becomes a place inhabited by demons and evil spirits. The lamentations that appear during the third millennium rise to a crescendo in the second and first, and bear witness to an ever-rising tide of barbarism, which battered the walls of the cities, bringing death and slavery to thousands and mortal fear to all. The people looked to a strong ruler and an army to protect them, and this was particularly true of Mesopotamia, but we also hear the same lament from Egypt, and no doubt we would have heard it also from China and India if there was time to go into those civilizations. Now, Sargon of Akkad is the first ruler we hear of who boasts of his conquest of all the land and cities between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, washing his weapons in the sea. You can see that huge area. On the left, the Mediterranean, on the right, the Persian Gulf, and in between, all the land that he'd conquered. He started in one city, but it spread all through that area. So he was the first big conqueror. And like Moses, he was said to have been found in a basket by a river by two women who rescued him. And his daughter, Enheduanna, was a famous priestess whose poems have come down to us from that ancient time. And if any of you have the Divine Feminine, they're in that book. So the principal theme of the solar era, introduced by the Indo-European invaders, is the battle between light and darkness, good and evil, leading to the battle to conquer and subdue nature in the service of man. The feminine archetype associated with nature is split off from spirit. Nature and the earth are no longer sacred. Man becomes identified with spirit, and woman is identified with nature. And that becomes a sort of fixed position right the way until about 100 years ago. It just got stuck in a groove, as it were. And this is reflected in the theme of the Babylonian epic called the Enuma Elish, that was recited annually for 1,000 years at the spring equinox. It is a creation myth which tells the story of how the god Marduk defeated the mother goddess Tiamat, cut her body in half and made the heavens from one half and earth from the other. He then made humanity from the blood of Tiamat's murdered son. The violent imagery of this myth reflects the violence in that society and endorsed it as a pattern to emulate. It exalted the dominance of the male over the female. It's quite clear in the actual language of the myth what's happening. Here we have Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god Shamash, I can't pronounce it. There again, there's a big change because he's receiving them from a god and no longer from a goddess, as in Sumer, where Inanna was the guardian of the laws of civilization that were known as the May. So this is a big change. The goddess is no longer in the position of giving out the laws. We have the god instead. And this is about 1,000 years after the period when the other situation would have prevailed in Sumer. Now I'm going into a lot of maps, and I want you, when I go through them, I want you to look at the territory, the size of the territory. On the first one, on the left, we have the first Babylonian empire, which was really building on what Sargon had done before. In the second one, we have the Assyrian Empire, around 650 BC. You see it's spread to Egypt and up into what's modern Turkey, all the area where fighting is going on now. And in the third map, you have the Babylonian Empire, roughly from 606 to 536 BC. And there again, you can see how hugely it's grown. It's gone right up towards the Caspian and the Black Sea, halfway through Turkey, far into Iran, and down into Egypt. So in 721 BC, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, called Samaria, the area was called Samaria, were taken into captivity by the Assyrians and never heard of again. Nobody's ever been able to trace them. This was the first example of ethnic cleansing. And in 597 BC, the Babylonian captivity of the Jews took place, and many of them, particularly the richer and more powerful people, were taken off to Babylon. Not everyone went. Quite a few went to Alexandria, but even so, this was a huge exodus of people. And I thought I'd just give you this picture of the imagined palace of Ashurbanipal, who was the Assyrian ruler until 627 BC. It must have been splendid. I mean, they were magnificent buildings and wonderful sculptures and incredible wealth that was lavished on them. So you can imagine what the life of the kings was like. And here we have the enormous, colossal Persian Empire, which goes right up to the Indus Valley on the right, right into India, or modern Pakistan, and right over to Greece on the left. It's absolutely colossal, down into Africa, Egypt. I don't know how they made it or got it, but that was what happened in the end. This is the Persian Empire at its height under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. Now Cyrus was a wonderful king and a very enlightened ruler, and he conquered the Babylonian Empire in 539 BC and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. So he was seen as their savior, and he was really almost worshipped as their deliverer, having conquered the Babylonian Empire. I hope you're finding this interesting. I'm interested in it all, although it's quite complicated. And here, please, will you look at the size of the Roman Empire, how it extended down into Africa, east far into Turkey and Palestine, and the whole of Europe, and up towards Hungary and the Netherlands. It was just incredible. The Roman Empire was enormous and minutely and efficiently controlled throughout its vast reach. In all these centuries of kings boasting of their territorial conquests and the building of giant empires, we hear very little about the suffering generated by these conquests. The weeping widows, the mothers who lost sons, the raped women, the orphaned children, and the crops and patterns of sowing and harvesting devastated by the foraging armies passing over them, the sacked cities and the exquisite works of art pillaged and looted. The long chronicle of conquest and human sacrifice which continues today, the drive for power and the subjugation of enemies might truly be named the dark shadow of the solar age, and we're still locked into the mythology of conquest, supremacy, and human sacrifice. So here we have Plato and Aristotle. The shamanic wisdom of the pre-Socratic philosophers seems to have vanished with them, although Parmenides was the teacher of Plato. Plato's philosophy underlies the philosophical tradition of Western civilization, just as Aristotle's philosophy was to underlie the later development of science. Unfortunately, Plato's concept of the word nous was interpreted by future philosophers to mean mind, and eventually even rational mind, rather than a subtle faculty of perception, which can apprehend archetypal ideas and concepts, which are noetic rather than material. That is a faculty that has to be cultivated and developed. Later, this faculty of deeper insight or perception would be called gnosis. Plato's concept of the soul as a divinely created living thing, of which all other living things are parts, seems somehow to have got lost with all the emphasis on mind. And what happened with the gods? There were gods and goddesses in other cultures as well, not only just one single god or goddess. But in Greece, we have Zeus making a kind of takeover bid for the soul kingship. He's the ruler. And he and his two brothers, Poseidon and Hades, take over the former domains of the Great Mother, the sky, the sea, and the underworld. Gaia remains goddess of earth. Nobody dares to touch her. But you have Athena, Artemis, and Persephone become daughters of Zeus now, even though they're still great goddesses in their own right. And do you remember the story of Persephone being raped into the underworld by Hades? Demeter has to go and beg Zeus to do something. She can't act on her own. So it's quite interesting to watch all these little differences that are coming in. Now I'm coming to the myth of the solar hero, and you have a paper attached about this because it's a tremendously important myth. And we find it in the Greek hero myths, in the one of Perseus slaying the Gorgon, with the picture on the left, Theseus slaying the Minotaur, Jason seizing the golden fleece from the great serpent in the tree guarded by the great serpent. And we have Apollo slaying the she-dragon at Delphi, who was the guardian of the sacred site. Can you imagine such a thing? In the earlier culture, it just wouldn't have happened. Apollo would never have dared to slay the she-dragon, which was the guardian of the deep waters at Delphi, the sacred waters at Delphi. So there we are. Those are the sort of main hero myths of the Greek period, although there are other ones as well. So what does the myth of the hero, solar hero, tell us about ourselves? This myth, I think, reflects an immense change in human consciousness, the formulation of an entirely new perception of life and of ourselves, one where man aspires to be in control of his destiny, where the emphasis is on the outstanding male as the carrier of advance for the human race. One of the most important features of the solar era is the differentiation of the individual from the tribal group through his prowess as a warrior. He dons the mantle of the solar hero. His deeds are sung in the courts of kings and in the marketplace of cities for at least 1,000 or 2,000 years. There are two famous books that set the scene for the emergence of the individual, and these are the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Achilles and Odysseus are the prototypes of the solar hero whose prowess in battle is legendary. So all these hero myths and stories gave young men a model to copy, and all suggest that men had to face and overcome the power of the instinct to paralyze with terror, as in the famous story of Theseus and the Minotaur, or Perseus and the Gorgon. This is what young men still have to face in war, when they have to resist the power of the instinct to paralyze them with terror. So in the Iliad, we follow the deeds of Achilles, the invincible warrior who, like Gilgamesh, has a goddess mother and a human father. In a furious rage because Hector, the son of King Priam of Troy, has killed Patroclus, a young man dear to him, who had secretly put on his armor, Achilles kills Hector and drags his body round the walls of Troy. The Trojan War ends with the defeat of Troy and the return of the Greeks to their homeland. But there Agamemnon, leader of the Greek army, is murdered by his wife Clytemnestra to avenge his sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia in order to be granted a fair wind for Troy by the goddess Artemis. Clytemnestra in turn is murdered by her son Orestes, who is pursued by the avenging Furies until the goddess Athena intervenes and he is released from the curse of seeking vengeance. All this is told in a wonderful book by Aeschylus called the Oresteia, a fantastic myth. Now I come to the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, and Google has drawn the American map, if you look at the bottom map, the map of America over his conquests, so that you see the huge size of them. There again, they're immense territory that somehow he conquered and also had to govern after that. Until his death, Alexander the Great was absolutely driven by the desire for conquest that led him through Persia as far as Afghanistan, where there are still children that are named after him and even have blonde hair and blue eyes. History doesn't tell us what his tutor Aristotle thought of his astonishing life path, but we know he slept with a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, close to his bedside. The beautiful funeral wreath on the right was his father's, Philip of Macedon, who was murdered at his daughter's wedding. Alexander's grave has never been found, but Philip's grave at Vergina in northern Greece is astounding for the magnificence and fine workmanship of its grave goods. And I do urge you to go there if you possibly have a chance, because they're simply unbelievable. We do not hear the voice of women throughout this long era, save in the plays of the great Greek tragedians. In Euripides' heart-wrenching play, The Trojan Women, we can listen to what women suffered during these 5,000 years. The fate of the women whose men had lost the battle was to be sold in slavery, their male children murdered, as Andromache's young son was flung from the walls of Troy. We can see this archaic pattern acted out in Syria and Iraq today, in the enslavement and rape of the Yazidi women and the beheading of enemies by the warriors of Islamic State. Raped, orphaned, and widowed in ceaseless conflicts, women lost generation after generation of their sons, brothers, and fathers, as these were conscripted to fight ongoing territorial wars. It seems to me that not much has changed in 5,000 years. That is, morally speaking, anyway. As I've said before, the primary theme of solar mythology is the battle between good and evil, light and darkness. This theme originated in Persia with the great sage Zoroaster and is reflected in this 15th century image of the solar hero killing a dragon by Pisanello. It is a myth that polarizes and divides, and it is this myth that still unconsciously drives the battle to conquer and subdue nature in the service of man. Despite its huge cultural achievements, this 5,000-year-long era has been dominated by conquest, territorial expansion, and the creation of these gigantic empires, culminating in the situation we face today in the Middle East, with thousands of desperate people fleeing death and destruction of their homes and livelihoods, and the threat of the destruction of our species as a whole with nuclear weapons, or whatever other method of destruction can be devised. But this myth also describes humanity's immense evolutionary task of bringing human consciousness from a state of virtual unconsciousness or darkness to the fullest development or state of enlightenment of which it is capable. Through eons of Earth time, we can now trace the story of the evolution of life on this planet, our own separation and emergence from the matrix of nature, and our arduous quest for greater understanding of life and of ourselves through search, suffering, and heroic endeavor. It was the role of the Buddha, of Christ, and the other great teachers of humanity, of which there have been many, to raise human consciousness to the enlightened state. The Buddha lived at the same time as the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece, and the dates of his birth and death vary considerably. But now I need to turn to the second immensely powerful Christian myth that dominates Christian civilization from the 4th century AD and has had a profound effect on the development of Western civilization. The myth of the fall of man originates in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, and for 2.5 millennia it has been interpreted as literal fact and as divine revelation. It became the foundation of Christian doctrine and was presented as the reason why we needed the sacrificial death of the Son of God to ensure our salvation. So in this myth, the image of deity is finally changed from Great Mother to Great Father. Divine immanence is lost. The emphasis is on the transcendence of God or Spirit. Earth becomes a place of exile and punishment for primordial sin. Man is given dominion over the earth, but he is no longer part of the divine order. He is exiled to a world contaminated by the fall and subject to sin, suffering, and death. Now, I know this because I've done a lot of research, but by a clever priestly inversion by some priest in the First Temple in Jerusalem, the goddess Asherah, who was at that time worshipped as the Queen of Heaven and the great goddess in the First Temple in Jerusalem, was deliberately demoted into the human and flawed figure of Eve, who still strangely carries the title that the goddess once held, Mother of all living. In Genesis 3, God says to Eve, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And God says to Adam, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree, cursed is the ground for thy sake, and in sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. For nearly 2,000 years, countless millions or even billions have assimilated the message of this cruel, rejecting and punishing God, and felt themselves burdened and, as it were, burdened with original sin. They couldn't get out of it. It was sitting on their shoulders forever. If we look at the myth of the fall from the perspective of the evolution of consciousness, this beautiful picture is by Cranach, and it's the pre-fall situation in the garden. If we look at the myth from the perspective of the evolution of consciousness, the whole myth can be read as a metaphor that describes the birth of self-awareness and our separation from the matrix of nature, the Garden of Eden out of which we have evolved. But the radical change of consciousness which it reflects tore us out of nature and led to pathological symptoms of anxiety and the compensatory desire for power and security resulting from a profound experience of dissociation, separation, and loss, symptoms which are similar to those a child exhibits when it has lost its mother. We lost the feeling of connection between ourselves and an invisible ground of spirit, active and present within the visible world. And we lost the sense of kinship with all creation. I wonder also whether the Garden of Eden perhaps wasn't a memory of the pre-cataclysmic world that we lost so suddenly and catastrophically that I described in my first talk. Unfortunately, even tragically, the myth was taken literally as divine revelation, and the Christian psyche was imprinted with the belief that human nature was fallen, marred in sin, punished by God, and condemned to exile and suffering on earth. Christians have been taught and have believed that their only chance of redemption was the doctrines and rituals of the Church and the saving grace of the sacrificial death of the Son of God. There was no salvation for those who were not Christians. Nowhere in the myth of the fall do we find the celebration of the sacred nature of sexual love, as in the lunar era, nor the recognition of this world as a sacred order of reality. On the contrary, expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the suffering of both man and woman were presented as a divinely imposed punishment for the role of our primal ancestors in initiating the fall. The idea of God as a deity willing to sacrifice his only son for the redemption of humanity entered theological history. Henceforth, worship was directed away from the earth towards the transcendent Father in heaven. Animism and all rituals of relationship with nature and the Great Mother or Great Goddess were ruthlessly suppressed. And there is no more striking image of this sense of exile and loss than our expulsion from the Garden of Eden, with an angel with a flaming sword barring our entry, our re-entry rather. And here is one of my favorite pictures. It's a tapestry from Florence of Adam blaming Eve, saying, "She did it." I think this myth has had a disastrous effect on the human psyche and on Western civilization as a whole. It led to deep feelings of sexual guilt and to a virulent misogyny because all women were identified with Eve as the ultimate cause of the fall. This myth, in my view, is the origin of the misogyny which spread like a contagious virus through the three patriarchal religions, a misogyny that reached its most obscene expression in the witch trials of the 15th to 18th centuries. So what were the effects of the tremendous archetypal shift of emphasis from lunar to solar mythology, from creator as mother to creator as father? Fear, guilt, and shame have been the underlying emotions of this whole era, particularly in Christianity. Fear of God, fear of divine punishment, fear of doing wrong, fear of guilt and punishment for a sexual aberration such as homosexuality, fear and shame in case anything hidden was revealed and punished, the belief that the body must be controlled, mortified, and made to suffer for its desires, and in general brought into a relationship of subjection to the mind, is very deeply ingrained in the Christian psyche. The primary mistake in Christian teaching was to split nature from spirit and body from soul. The soul and the instinctive feeling values associated with it were consistently overridden and ignored, and the voice of woman was silenced. The second mistake was the belief that in order to cultivate the soul, we had to deny, repudiate, and even inflict suffering on the body. Suffering or denial inflicted on the body were believed to open the path to God. In the Catholic Church, a man could only be ordained as a priest by repudiating his sexuality. So the question I would put to you is this: did this myth bring us to a higher, more developed state of consciousness, or did it hold back our evolution? Was it perhaps responsible for the unspeakable cruelties and oppression inflicted on the peoples that Christians conquered, as well as the people tortured and murdered by the Inquisition? Guilt can lead to the desire to get rid of it by persecuting others. This is a very important point to remember, and I would only know it because I'm a psychotherapist. Now, the effect of these two polarizing mythologies, the battle of light against darkness and the myth of the fall, are that the feminine archetype, which embraced nature, soul, body, and matter, was split off from spirit. Nature and the earth were no longer sacred. Nature was effectively desouled or desacralized. Man was identified with mind and spirit, and woman was identified with body and nature. Woman became subject to man, giving rise to the misogyny that still afflicts us today. Body was split off from mind, and mind from soul. After AD 418, church doctrine taught that sexual intercourse transmitted the original sin of the fall. According to the teaching of St. Augustine, original sin was transmitted like a virus through the sexual act. Adam's sin had corrupted the whole of nature and made it subject to death. But the entire sorry story was initiated by Eve. This unbelievable belief was incorporated into church doctrine at that time in 418. So the rest of my talk is a bit gloomy for a while, because Christianity from the 4th century destroyed many of the great temples and works of art of the pagan world. much as Islamic State has destroyed the buildings and sculptures of Palmyra and Mosul. The Christian mobs literally attacked anything they could see of the pagan culture, any sculptures, any statues, any temples, anything at all that could be destroyed, they destroyed. In the 4th century, the Christian emperors Constantine and Theodosius burnt as many of the Gnostic Gospels as they could lay their hands on. Fortunately, in 1945, a discovery at Nag Hammadi in Egypt restored many of these to us. And the destruction of the great temple of Eleusis and the closing of the Platonic Academy in Athens were ordered by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. So that was the last temple that was destroyed. Great Temple of Eleusis, which had stood for 3,000 years. Fortunately, this is amazing, the teachers from the academy were invited by the king of Persia to teach in a Persian university near Basra. This is in the 6th century, already well-established universities in Persia, bringing with them the priceless manuscripts of the Greek philosophers, the mainstream of which had been destroyed in the Great Fire. That I'm going to talk about. These were translated into Persian and after the Arab conquest in the 7th century into Arabic. They were taken to Toledo in Spain and were translated there into Latin in the 11th century, eventually reaching the great scholars of Paris and Chartres. It's an extraordinary story of the integrity of the scholars who were responsible for doing all this. Now we come to the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria, which I always feel deeply. And I found these pictures on Google, which gave you an idea of the scrolls that would have been stored there, at the scholars trying to find what they wanted, sitting at tables and studying. And finally, the fire, because it was set on fire by a Christian mob, again, on the orders of the Emperor Theodosius in AD 381. The catastrophic loss of priceless manuscripts from Egyptian and Greek civilization. There was a remarkable young philosopher called Hypatia who had taught philosophy there until she was murdered again by a Christian mob. Horrific story, I mean, unbelievable. Makes me furiously angry when I think about it. Now the quest, coming to the 12th century, the quest for the Holy Grail was an attempt to restore the image of the feminine aspect of deity as the Holy Spirit. It was related also to an attempt to establish a new church of the Holy Spirit in the Languedoc area of France, which would challenge the Catholic Church in Rome and restore the original teaching of Jesus and his closest disciples, including Mary Magdalene. There's a huge story involved in that, which you can read on my website under Esclarmonde de Foix, who was one of the great leaders of the church in the Languedoc area. Now we come to Chartres and the building of the great cathedrals, because the 12th century was also the age of the building of the great cathedrals and the rise of the universities in Europe. The Crusades, awful as they were, had initiated an age of exploration and discovery, and Muslim craftsmen came to France to work on the windows of Chartres. Strangely, even the 3 entrance portals of Chartres have the pointed shape of the doors of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And somebody must have copied those, drawn them, and taken them to Chartres where they were copied. They knew about it, and there was contact between the Europeans and the people in the Middle East. It wasn't all crusades and fighting. Now the Greeks, the Persians, and the Romans were largely tolerant of other religions in their empires. And southern Spain, under Muslim rule from the 7th to the 11th century, was also tolerant of both Christians and Jews. It was an extraordinary culture, the Moorish culture of southern Spain, absolutely marvelous, with the greatest scholars and people talking to each other from 3 different religions. It was just wonderful. But then in 1492, Boabdil, the Muslim ruler of Granada, surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella, the Christian rulers of northern Spain. And strengthened by this final defeat of the Moors and under the pernicious influence of the Inquisition and a man called Torquemada, they decreed in the Treaty of Alhambra in 1492 that all practicing Jews would have to leave Spain within 4 months. Those who remained and didn't convert to Christianity were burnt at the stake and had their property confiscated. So this was an utterly new initiative, if you like, and it changed the whole history of Europe, and indeed, right to our present time, it's had an effect. It was absolutely disgraceful that what they did, and they destroyed a great deal of the wonderful culture of Spain because of it, that had come from the Jewish influence. 100 years later, the Moriscos, or descendants of the Muslims, were also expelled. These 2 expulsions were a fatal mistake and have led to the huge problems that we face today. I've put in these 2 pictures found on Google. They don't really illustrate the suffering involved, but they show all the boats and the people being marshaled to get onto them. Some did come back. Some sort of crept back in again, particularly in the south around Granada, and they weren't expelled again. So there's a lot of controversy about this, and you need to read about it. There's a great deal of stuff on Google if you want to read it. But the injustice of these expulsions was never forgotten, and the call in 2014 of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Islamic State, to create a new caliphate was partly to avenge the expulsion of the Muslim population of Spain in 1609. So you can see how long these things last. People don't forget. So now we come to the age of the great explorers. And by the way, Columbus set out in 1492, the same date as that terrible thing of expulsion of the Jews. He had to wait till all the Jews were out of the harbors before he could set off. The great explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries opened up the world to Europe, which engaged in trade with these distant places. But this soon led to the desire to control these places as colonies and to the rise of the powerful empires of Spain and Portugal, England and the Netherlands from the 16th century onwards. Magellan's voyage was incredible because he went round Cape Horn, South America, to the East Indies across the Pacific. It was just unbelievable courage. He was actually killed in the Philippines in a fight there, but his crews and the other ships with him went right the way around and came back to Europe. Incredible story. I remember it was my favorite story when I was about 14. And then we come now to the conquistadors, a very dark chapter indeed, because the conquests of Spain and Portugal in South and Central America led to appalling crimes committed against the people of these countries. The attempt forcibly to convert them to Christianity, and the stripping of vast quantities of gold from their sacred buildings and treasuries to send back to Europe in galleons that were loaded with loot. The European Christian monarchs who promoted this discovery and invasion and colonization of the Americas were supported in their genocide by what is called the doctrine of discovery or domination that was issued by several papal bulls from the Vatican beginning in 1493. And the Inquisition was imported to these countries, and many people were burnt at the stake, including many Jews who'd probably taken their businesses there or even emigrated there. And they were hunted down by the Inquisition and killed. Terrible story. Now I come to this wonderful image of Florence in the 15th century, because a new era began in Renaissance Italy in the 15th century with Copernicus' great discovery of the heliocentric nature of the universe. I think I may need to go on a bit here. Yeah, here we are. A new era began in Renaissance Italy in the 15th century with Copernicus' great discovery of the heliocentric nature of the universe, the translation of Hermetic and Platonic manuscripts by Marsilio Ficino, the awakening to the beauty of the human body in painting and sculpture, and the influence of Kabbalah and alchemy, and the work of an extraordinary group of supremely gifted architects, writers, painters, sculptors, and poets who brought brilliant light into Europe after what had been a dark age of persecution in the 13th century, followed by the Black Death in the 14th. In 1486, Pico della Mirandola, only 23 years old, imagine 23 years old is the age of my grandson, gave his great oration on the dignity of man before a prestigious gathering of philosophers that were invited by him to Rome. In it, he offered a new image of man and the choice before him. This is part of what he said, speaking as if with the voice of God. The nature of all other beings is limited and constrained within the bounds of laws prescribed by us. Thou, constrained by no limits, in accordance with thine own free will, in whose hand we have placed thee, shall ordain for thyself the limits of thy nature. We have set thee at the world's centre, that thou mayest from thence more easily observe whatever is in the world. We have made thee neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honour, as though the maker and moulder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer. Now you can imagine what an uproar this caused in Rome, and not only among the philosophers, because it was a gauntlet thrown in the face of the Vatican, because it challenged the whole concept of the powerlessness of man that had been offered by the Christian Church. Pico died in 1494, about 10 years later, possibly murdered by the Vatican, although there's no proof of that. It's possibly my own projection. I put in this beautiful picture by Fra Angelico because the Virgin held the image of the feminine throughout the Renaissance. There were hundreds and thousands of most beautiful paintings of the Annunciation, of the visit of the three wise kings. The whole of the Christian drama was painted over and over again by the courts of Italy, great painters of the courts, supported by the great wealth of the rulers of those states. I've got this picture in my room here. It's one of my favorites. Then we come again to darkness and the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. Because the vicious hatred between Catholics and Protestants, stemming from Luther's revolutionary action in condemning the Catholic Church for its venality and corruption, and launching the new religion of Protestantism, unleashed a terrible war in Germany in which a third of the population was killed or died from disease and starvation. And out of this horror eventually came the Enlightenment of the 18th century and the movement from religion to science, because people were really sickened by religion, sickened by all these terrible wars and the suffering, and they wanted to move into a different atmosphere. So we carry within us two kinds of consciousness, two ways of knowing. One is the lunar and instinctive, participatory, relational way of knowing, mediated through the heart and the right hemisphere of the brain. I'm going to talk about that next time. Solar, an objective, linear way of knowing, mediated through thinking and more of the left hemisphere of the brain. An unconscious conflict developed in us as the solar way of knowing was superimposed on the older lunar way. The linear thinking of the left hemisphere, with all its bureaucratic tendencies, became dominant, and we lost all awareness of the sacredness of life and of the earth and the cosmos. This conflict was projected into all the conflicts in the world during the last 4,000 to 5,000 years. And I think this inner conflict lies at the root of all the repressions, conquests, and atrocities committed by the patriarchal religions. The increasing autonomy of human consciousness resulted in a growing sense of separation from the natural world, and the conviction that man had the right to master and control nature and the world for his own benefit. The shadow side of this, as I've said, has been the rituals of sacrifice that have been enacted by all civilizations. And that goes for China and India as well, which we haven't got no time to go into. From their inception, the three patriarchal religions eliminated the image of the goddess, as well as all traces of animism, or the belief that spirit was present in the forms of the natural world. All identified spirit with a wholly transcendent monotheistic concept of God. Only the indigenous cultures kept the older story alive, the story of life on this planet as a sacred order, and our relationship with the earth and cosmos a sacred trust. In the patriarchal civilizations, woman was banished from her ancient role as Sibyl, priestess, and prophetess. Her voice was silenced until about 100 years ago. During the lunar era, we were held within a cosmic whole. In the solar era, that whole was divided into creator and creation. We need a new story, a new cosmology, and a new concept of spirit that includes nature and the sacred feminine, if we are to create a civilization worthy of the name and discover a higher destiny and a different goal. So in my next talk, I will look at some aspects of this new story. So thank you. This has been the most difficult thing I've ever done, I think, getting all this material in one piece in 1 hour. But it's been worth it because I've learned a lot and enjoyed myself doing it.
Thank you, Anne. We learned a lot from you. What a rich presentation. Lots of food for thought.
Plenty of food, yeah.
Plenty. Well, I have 2 quick questions. None of them are really light, as usual. I refer to your book in the solar era section. You really emphasize the developing ego and how it contributed to the separation of nature and cosmos and humankind. And I just want to ask you that what is the ego plays a part in this warmongering attitude of humanity, this addiction to war? What is it that didn't really exist maybe as much in a lunar era?
It's to do with the fact that the ego creates the world as it sees it, and it's based on anxiety and insecurity, if you like, because it knows it's not in the supreme position, but it wants to be. So it wants to be sure of itself and sure of what it's doing. And one of the ways of doing that is conquering other people and throwing your weight around, so to speak. I mean, you can see it in bullying in schools. It's that sort of thing. And it's usually someone who is weak, who's the bully, who attacks other children, so to speak. But underneath is a sense of being weak or vulnerable. And so the only way to get rid of that feeling is to attack those you think are stronger and bring them down to your level, and then you feel okay.
Yes. So is it all about insecurity?
Yes, I think so. I think it's the essential insecurity, because nobody's told us right the way through, lunar or solar, what we're doing on this planet. Why are we here? I shall go into this next time. What are we doing? What's the purpose of our presence here? Why do we have to go through so much immense suffering with all these wars, empires and everything, when we don't know what it's all about? And so the reason becomes conquest. The reason for being here becomes we have to be more powerful. We have to be successful in business. We have to be better than other people. And that all comes from insecurity and not knowing. If we were sure of ourselves, we wouldn't need to do all this. We wouldn't have to do it all. And of course, egged on, once you get weapons from the Bronze Age onwards, the weapons get bigger and stronger and more powerful until we have now these nuclear weapons. They've accelerated, the art of making weapons has accelerated all these 4,000 years until we have now weapons which can destroy the whole world really with just a few bombs. And that is all part of, there's somebody asking where he can get the 2 documents.
We will send both of them after this lecture. I wanted to say this, so we will send these 2 documents to you. You will get it in an email. My other question is, Anne, that is it all about survival as well? Is the survival instinct is the strongest in us? Like you talk about the ritual and sacrifice, even partly in the lunar era. So is it about fear of God and the self-anxiety for the sake of survival?
It is survival, because the ego's thing is entirely based on the survival instincts of the older brain system. If you read my article on my website on depression, there are 3 different responses to threat. One is flight, the other is to fight, and the third is paralysis. So those are the three methods that the ego has of dealing with a threat to its survival. It needs to be a lot thought about it. I thought about it for years, but there's masses of material on my website, and they're my books. But the poor ego, I mean, is very fragile. And because it doesn't know why it's here and what the relationship with the whole is, it's been told it has to worship this God up in heaven. But the God in heaven doesn't say, I'm so sorry for you, poor ego. You don't need to worry so much about all these things. You've got yourself in a terrible state, but you don't need it. You don't need to be so worried. But we can't stop at the moment. We don't know how to stop the programming that we've received, which is pushing us towards our own extinction. This is a huge problem, which I'll try and go into next time.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's just one more thing, and this is, I just took this paragraph from the solar hero myth, which you will all get after this call. And you are saying that why did we lose the ancient lunar participatory way of knowing? The answer seems to be that as we developed the capacity for linear sequential thought, we slowly lost touch with the older instinctive participatory way of knowing. This change of consciousness is reflected in the new solar mythology, which has a different emphasis and orientation than lunar mythology. Clearly, the evolution of consciousness took a wrong turn. However, I can see that there's more and more people becoming nature and earth conscious and holistic. So there is a tendency to refine the participatory lunar era way of thinking. Do you agree that such progress is fast enough to avoid the scenario which could be detrimental to millions of people and the planet?
Well, I think things are moving very fast now. First of all, we've had the scientists' warning last year. Secondly, we've had David Attenborough's wonderful programs showing us what we're doing to the planet. Thirdly, we've got the environmental movement, which is growing in strength. Fourthly, we've got the population business of being aware that we can't have so many children. We have to really reduce our population. So there are lots of things going on, which are contributing to our reconnecting with nature, respecting nature, and breaking the old pattern of war and empire. But it's touch and go. I mean, whether we make it or not, I don't know. It's touch and go. But the new generation coming up, and Georg's generation really has got to take this matter in hand and insist that governments pay attention to the need to change our whole way of attitude to the earth and the planet, and build far more renewable energy, things like that, you know. Unfortunately, Germany has gone back to coal, whatever you call it, coal production, yes, which is a terrible pity.
Yeah, it's a shame. Well, thank you, Anne. Well, let's turn to our audience. I can see that Jim Garrison would like to contribute. Jim.
Hi, Anne. Hi, Georgie. Thank you once again for a brilliant summary. Knowing a little bit about this history, I marveled that you could put it all in an hour.
I marveled too.
That was a triumph in and of itself.
I said to my husband, I don't think I can do it this time.
But you know, it's interesting. I was sent a study today, this morning, that I'm going to send on to you and Georgie, and I can share with the group. It's a study that came out from a study group based in Vienna, where they looked at the relationship between what they call big gods, which they define as moralizing deities that punish transgressors, and human society. And they looked at over 300,000 documents. They looked at over 500 different societies in every corner of the globe over the last 10,000 years. And the question was, does human society develop the notion of a moralizing deity coterminous with, before, or after the complexification of society? And they have just released their study that without exception, there's no example that they can find where a human society has developed the notion of a moralizing deity before or even during complexification, it only comes later as sort of a rationalization or a post factum attempt to reinforce a certain coercive institutional structure. So my question to you is a sort of a variation of what Georgie was asking. What is it about the complexification of human society that would inevitably lead to solar kind of mythologies and this coercive light against darkness and the myth of the fall? I would have thought that it's almost counterintuitive that as things become more complex, and I would have think at least 50% of human societies would become more lunar rather than less lunar. Why is it that it's like Ken Wilber has said, there's no example that we know of when a society went into the agricultural revolution that it did not become patriarchal. So my question is, why this kind of 100% kind of inevitability toward the solar? Was that, when anything is 100%, that implies to me that it's less a function of sort of free will as almost a function of DNA, or kind of the organism, like a caterpillar going into the chrysalis to a butterfly, right? And I've always puzzled at that. And this study today sort of reinforced my puzzlement. I mean, what is it about complexity that leads to solarization?
I think it's survival instincts. I think what I was saying before, it's at a certain point, at a certain level, survival instincts kick in and say, this is no longer safe. We have to have some sort of organizing authority. We have to have some superior god or goddess who's looking after all of this. We can't manage it on our own. And things are getting out of, I'd hate to mention Brexit, but look at the chaos there. There is a need now for a strong something or other individual to come in and just knock everybody's heads together and just say, shut up, the lot of you, get down to what we can really communicate on, And there's a crisis point, and then something comes in which creates order. And in that order, you may get the God coming in who's going to punish and set laws and give laws to Moses that have to be obeyed, because it's felt that society is sufficiently complex to need a structure. And I don't think it just comes naturally in the smaller communities. When you look back to the lunar time, they were very, very small communities, very small little villages, separated quite distantly from each other. There were no sort of big cities, as far as we know, until about 3000 BC. And then you have the people being invaded by the tribal, by the Indo-Europeans and the Semitic tribes, who had a totally different mythology, because they'd been hunter-gatherers, they hadn't been settled. And they had the mythology really of survival from day to day, rather than knowing that tomorrow would be all right because we've got enough food in the fields and that sort of thing. So a different, complete psychology there of the invaders coming in, imposing their will on the agriculturalists, and the agriculturists not knowing what to do and having to conform in order to survive. I think it's something like that, but it doesn't really answer your question, but it's a very perplexing situation. But you find it in all societies. And of course, the king was the model for the god, because the king was the ruler of the society down here. So we had to have a male ruler in the sky up above to sort of tie in with that. We didn't have an image of the sacred marriage at all.
Well, the reason why this is interesting to me, and I know you'll probably get it in the next couple of lectures, but we're now, in terms of human evolution, at a level of complexity far more hyper complex than anything, 3, 2, or 1,000 years ago. And at this moment of ultimate complexification, we're undergoing a metamorphosis of consciousness. So it seems almost like a supreme paradox that the initial experience of complexification gives rise to patriarchy and these punishment, these moralizing deities. And yet at the end of the complexification, when the moralizing deities are the most intense in a way, humanity nevertheless somehow in hyper complexity is now changing its consciousness, which means that there doesn't necessarily have to be a connection between complexification and solarization. You see what I'm saying? It'll be interesting to see whether we can pull it off, but our present generation seems to be running counter to all the data of the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, there are many things here. There's a wonderful woman called Elizabeth Sartoris who wrote a book about
oh yes,
when you get to a certain point, instead of fighting each other, you push through to a new form of life in biology. That's very badly put, but the book she's written explains it. And also she uses the metaphor of the caterpillar changing into the butterfly. We've been in the caterpillar form for 5,000 years, and now we're just beginning to break through into the butterfly form. I think that that's something that we can remember as an image, which might help us. It's a terrific struggle to get out of that caterpillar carapace that's been imprisoning us. But we can do it. But I agree with you. It's puzzling. The whole thing is just a terrific puzzle and mystery. But I'm following a man called Greg Braden, his course, and he's got some very interesting ideas, which I'm going to bring into my next talk. And there are people, particularly in America, who are teaching the Shift Network and who are bringing through these new ideas with an idea of ourselves as completely different from what we've been told we are, that we have a different DNA and we don't descend from the apes. We have our own specific DNA, which started 200,000 BC. And I mean, these are interesting new ideas. So they're breaking the Darwinian concept and taking us into a new area altogether and changing our view of ourselves. Because he says, which makes great sense, if I'm not going on too long, he says that we've been conditioned to feel that we're powerless, helpless, and there's no one there to sort of help us. And this other idea of ourselves gives us a completely different view of who we are, and a much more positive view, so that we are not helpless. We can actually create the destiny we want instead of being the victim of it.
Well, that's why I loved your first lecture, because you just opened up a whole different origin story.
Yeah.
That was quite compelling. But anyway, Georgie, I know there's other people you want to call on, but just thank you so much, Anne. Such a rich, profound discussion.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim, for your contribution. Now let's hear from Magdalena.
Hi there. Hi. Thank you so much. That was so rich. And even though it was so much information, what's incredible is that you extracted the most important information. So it's almost like, even though all this knowledge has been lost over the years with the destruction of the libraries and so on, we're still able to pull out what's important. And I'm really keen to reflect on the new story and the new era. But in reflection of this old story that we've been handed with the Abrahamic religions, and that the key roles that have been the key figures, the key leaders are mostly men in the Abrahamic traditions. There are female characters and they're very prominent, but they don't take a leadership role as much. So I'm curious on your take about women as leaders in this new story, in this new era, and really finding a balance between the feminine and masculine, the evolution, the new story, really coming out of these old dichotomies that haven't served us well, and just repeated cycles of war and disconnection. And of course, we see that now, that there are still this tribal warfare between the Abrahamic religions in a globalized way. So one of the things, of course, that's happening in Europe is that there is a Christian resistance to these so-called Islamic invaders, but then we see that also on the other side of the world, and it's having this reactionary response, terrorism happening in mosques or in synagogues. And so it's happening differently. There's still these traditional wars, traditional warfare, but I think terrorism generally between the Abrahamic religions is or excused by the Abrahamic religions, is happening more broadly. And what's really interesting for me too is that that is not the only part. The main point of the Abrahamic religions is that they are building on each other, and there's these beautiful messages of love and compassion that these leaders are trying to convey that are often not being highlighted. So my original question was about women leaders, this new era of female leadership emerging, and the balance between the feminine and masculine.
Well, I'm going to talk about that next time.
Okay.
But there is a danger that women copy the male model of trying to succeed and be powerful instead of being true to their own nature. So I'm going to talk about that next time as well. It's a very complicated situation now, because we're seeing the dying throes of the old pattern, and the new pattern isn't yet established enough to know where we stand exactly. Women are emerging all over the place, speaking up. Several of them in very prominent places are now my friends, and I can see they're doing new work and great work, but it's going to take time. It's not going to happen just from now and in the next 10 years. On the other hand, climate change is approaching so quickly, as we can see from the terrible situation in Mozambique, that it's going to accelerate the change. Everybody, men and women, are going to have to work together to do what's necessary to help everybody. It's going to be a question of really acting to help the whole world on the part of all women and all men. There won't be any distinction really between them. They'll be acting as one. So I don't think there'll be this old separation. That will go. There is no longer any time for that. So you'll see next time I should be addressing various different things of the new story, and also quantum physics, which is bringing in a new image of ourselves, going back to the lunar era concept. Can I say to people briefly, Georgie, that I can't unfortunately be anybody's friend because I simply haven't got time. I know that one or two of you have invited me to be your friend, but I just can't do it. If there's something you want to say, you can communicate through email from my website, send me an email and ask a question, but I can't generally enter into a sort of friendship. Apologies.
Thank you, and thank you, Magdalena. I know that Raffaele put his hand up, and do you still have a little bit, couple of more minutes energy to answer one more question, or would you like to postpone it until next time?
We can go ahead now, whatever you like. Yes, that would be nice.
Thank you very much. Raffaele, please go ahead.
Thank you for this extra time, and thank you for the presentation. I have a lot of questions. I'll narrow it down to one, and then the others, maybe I'll write them on the website. So the one that's more pulsating in my heart is that along the years in my explorations of this switch from matriarchal to patriarchal society, and from, as you say, from lunar to solar era, I came across an interpretation of this switch by someone called Sabine Lichtenfels. I can give you more references, but what matters to me now is the content. which I found really resonating with me. Of course, I'm in a male body, but still, you know, I'm part of this drama as every human being is. And I wanted to hear your opinion on that. And basically what this interpretation said is something along the lines of, okay, so when this transition, when this violent transition happened from lunar to solar era, actually it wasn't so much a case of the priesthood powering over the priestesshood, but it was a case of the female power realizing with tremendous grief and tremendous spirit of sacrifice that the moment had come to allow the male consciousness to be transformed from a boyish consciousness to like an adult consciousness, and that the only way that this could happen was going to be through immense suffering and upheaval. And so, you know, like that was the time when the young god that you mentioned in your books, that just appears as a sort of like younger male god, transformed into a man, but not in a harmonious and, you know, easy way, but with bloodshed and suffering. But what I like about this interpretation is that it takes the feminine away from the role of victim, from the role of like having just been powered on. And actually it says that with tremendous compassion and wisdom and spirit of sacrifice, the priestesshood sort of like gathered, you know, mythically together and said, okay, the time has come. The time has come for this to happen. And we know that we will endure 4,000 or 5,000 years of suffering. But then at some point, the male consciousness evolved, or the ego will evolve so much that it will want to reconnect to the feminine power and then usher in a new era of balance and an equilibrium. So I wanted to hear your take on this.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's in fact what Richard Tanner says in his Passion of the Western Mind, which I've quoted somewhere in my book. But he says that just what you said, that we've gone through this long era where the male psyche has developed itself. It's explored, it's fought, it's discovered, it's done extraordinary things. But now it needs to reconnect with the feminine and reconnect with the soul. And as you say, it's taken 5,000 years. I don't see the priestesses making this as a conscious decision. I think that this just happened, and I think it happened because of everything I've described, because of all the wars and the invasions, and people were so confused they hadn't got time to work things out really in that sort of way. And it wasn't a matriarchal society, it was a matrilineal, which is different. It's not that women ruled in the lunar, there was a men and women balance, particularly in the civilization of old Europe, very much so. In those pictures I showed with men and women together, so to speak. So the matriarchal thing has never really been, except perhaps in very small societies. But it was, they had a council of men and women together in which they said what's to be done with the village, and where we're going to get the food for the next season and that sort of thing. They worked it out together. It wasn't an either or. But under the patriarchy, the repression did come in, and women just didn't speak at all. They weren't consulted in any way. So there's a great bitterness in the feminine psyche, and there's been terrible suffering in the male, and the poor male has really been crucified throughout this time because he's had to offer his life again and again and again to these warrior kings, and he's had no choice. Until very recently, he couldn't, even in the First World War, if you opted out of military service, you were shot. And that was it. So it's very recently that we've changed our attitudes to men being able to say, I don't want to be a warrior, I'll serve in some other capacity. It's a big change in 1916 or 18 or whenever it was, when men were still shot. So we've made progress recently, a lot of progress, and we're making it very rapidly, I think, at the moment. But everything is like scrambled eggs in the thing. It hasn't yet gelled, not ready to be eaten. But it's coming there. And so I hope next week, we'll be able to take it further and more hopeful. And I am very critical of this era because I can't bear all the suffering, and also the children were left as orphans and everything. It must have been simply terrible. And also the rape of young boys and girls, which is we know about now, but it's gone on for thousands of years, and that's never been acknowledged as evil. So that also is a huge progress, that all these things are coming to light. This is what Jung meant by the shadow becoming conscious, that we're becoming aware that these things are not acceptable anymore and other things are not acceptable. So thank you very, very much, everybody. I'd love to teach you and love to speak. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation today.
That's beautifully done.
And just a quick word to those who left messages in the chat box, Amy Blumenshine and Randy and Kaelan, thank you. Hopefully we will hear from you, Randy, next time. I know that last time your internet connection wasn't strong enough, but we definitely make sure that we have time for everybody's contributions. If you wish to send an email to Anne, any of you, please do so via her website as she suggested. And thank you again, everybody, and see you next Thursday again for the final session.
Okay, bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, bye-bye.
Bye, Georgie.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Anne. Bye, Georgie. Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye, Magdalena.